government.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome all of you who braved the precipitation in LA that we rarely get this time of year. Today we're going to have a discussion and Q&A and book signing with Dr. Darnell Hunt. Darnell Hunt is director of the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies, as many of you know, and is also a professor of sociology here at UCLA. He has written extensively on race and media, including numerous scholarly journal articles and popular magazine articles. He's published 3 books, including the one that we're here to hear about, Channeling Blackness, Studies on Television and Race in America, Screening the Los Angeles Riots, Race, Scene, and Resistance, and O.J. Simpson, Facts and Fiction, News Rituals and the Construction of Reality. Prior to his positions at UCLA, he chaired the Department of Sociology at the University of Southern California. Dr. Hunt has also been a frequent public commentator on questions of media and race. He has been interviewed for dozens of television and radio programs on the topic, and the findings of his research studies have been reported in hundreds of newspaper articles throughout the United States and abroad. He has also participated in and moderated several panel discussions about media diversity sponsored by entities such as the Federal Communications Commission, the United Nations, the Congressional Black Caucus, and numerous colleges and universities. Dr. Hunt received a bachelor's degree in journalism from USC, an MBA from Georgetown University, and a PhD in sociology from UCLA. A native of Washington, D.C., he has lived in Los Angeles for the past 25 years. It gives me great pleasure and joy to introduce you to him. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Alex, for that warm introduction. I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about this particular project and really to have a discussion, a really informal discussion. Tell you a little bit about the book and really open it up for any type of questions you may have so that we can discuss some of the themes that this particular book addresses. Let me give you a little bit of background about this project. This book is the outgrowth of about 15 years of work on my part, both research-oriented as well as practitioner work. As some of you may know, in my prior life, before academia, I actually worked in the media. I went to business school. I had an undergrad degree in journalism, as Alex had mentioned. And I really saw myself as becoming a director and having, making some impact through the messages I communicate through movies or whatever. Eventually, I realized that maybe directing was not what I wanted to do and that news was my real calling in life. And so I planned to use my journalism degree and translate that into some type of management position in television. Hence my decision to go to business school. I went to business school on a fellowship from NBC, which was a program they had put together for minorities. The idea being there were so few minorities in media that they wanted to figure out a way to increase the numbers in the pipeline. So I was kind of poised to take advantage of that opportunity. I pursued the fellowship, got it, went to Georgetown University, got my MBA, and upon graduation, I was offered a job at WRC-TV in Washington, which is an NBC-owned and operated station. Eye-opening experience for me. My first assignment at WRC-TV was in the business office because, of course, I had an MBA and they figured I should be doing business-related activities, business plan, accounts receivables, that type of thing. But what I really wanted to do, of course, was get into the newsroom because my background was in journalism and I wanted to have some impact on, our understanding of what's happening in the world around us. Well, I kind of, bided my time. I rotated from the business office to the sales office, which is where the station interacts with advertisers and tries to convince them that their programming is best suited to the needs of the demographic they're trying to sell to. So I got a sense of, how that process works and how the station markets itself. I went from there to the promotion department, which is where the station tries to create a public image of what the station is. A lot of this for local stations revolves around the local newscast because they try to establish an identity with the anchors and they have eyewitness news or whatever the various names are for the news programs that become brand markers for the individual station in most cases. And last but not least, finally, I made it to the newsroom. What an eye-opener. Washington, D.C., as most of you know, has been called variously Chocolate City, various names like that, to again reflect the large and prominent black population there. To my surprise, of sorts, because we didn't talk about this in journalism school, when I got into the newsroom, I saw all the anchors who I knew. They were celebrity figures in D.C. Many of them were African American, prominent, had been on the air for years. A number of the reporters were African American, but the editorial staff was almost completely white. And as someone working in the newsroom, got to sit in on the editorial meetings in the morning when they read the Washington Post and try to decide, what the agenda was going to be for the day, what stories we were going to cover. Very quickly, I started seeing interesting patterns in how the racial perceptions of those in the newsroom were shaping what was newsworthy, what was important, what would be covered, and what wouldn't be covered. And, I had a background in journalism, which didn't prepare me for that. And I said, oh, this is interesting. As an African-American male, I'm sitting here, I'm seeing this. It's almost as if, I've been indoctrinated into the club, so there's no need to, censor or to edit what they're saying, because after all, this is what journalists do. This is how news is constructed. And so I really found myself wanting to get a better understanding of that. So in my spare time, when I was working in the newsroom, I just went and started, doing some citation searches to see if I could find what had been written on news construction and race. And there wasn't a lot. There was a lot on news construction, but not much on news construction and race. Certainly not that looked deeply at the process of news construction, the routines that journalists are engaged in, and really had an understanding from the inside out of what motivated journalists, what their constraints were, and how all of these things resulted in the types of images we see. So I guess I was in the newsroom for about 1.5 years or so, and I was offered a job in Chicago to essentially do what my boss in D.C. was doing. And it would have been a great position. Certainly something that when I went to business school I would have loved to have had. But this burning curiosity about what I was seeing in the newsroom became more important to me. And so as a safety, prior to getting the job offer, I had applied to graduate schools, UCLA one of them. And I, as you know, ultimately came here and did my PhD in sociology. When I did those citation searches, I found a number of works that, while they didn't really deal directly with the question I was interested in, really suggested to me that sociology was the way to go in terms of understanding the questions I was interested in. Hence my move to Los Angeles, my return to Los Angeles. I did my undergrad degree here in LA in journalism, and the real serious study of race and media. And of course, while I was here, 1992 happened, and that became the basis for the dissertation I would work on, which kind of expanded on this work pertaining to media and race. I also had a chance along the way to work with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. They came to Los Angeles in 1994 in the aftermath of 1993, in the aftermath of the 1992 uprisings, to ostensibly study, what types of factors had led to those events. And as you know, the newly sort of inaugurated Clinton administration was in office, and they were interested in sort of revisiting some of the questions that the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights had looked at in the late 1970s pertaining to the Hollywood industry and the exclusion of people of color. And so they wanted to kind of put those two things together. They figured, we're coming to LA anyway, so while we're here, why don't we look at the Hollywood industry? Besides, anecdotally, people are telling us that possibly some of the news coverage of the events exacerbated tensions that ultimately led to the events. So they wanted to kind of look at the two together. Well, it just so happened I was working on my dissertation about the events at the time, and I happened to run into a woman whose father had previously been one of the chairman of the commission. She was working for the LA Human Relations Commission here in Los Angeles, and she was sort of the liaison between the LA community and the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And she was looking for people who could sort of take the hand of the folks coming from Washington and lead them around LA media. So I ended up filling in that particular role. It was a great opportunity for me because I got to visit every single major news operation in the city, got to ask in-depth questions about how they construct news, what their routines are. And because I had worked in news, I had some idea of what goes on, but I wanted to look at it specifically as it pertained to questions of race. I also had a chance to meet with every major studio in town. We went to all the major networks, their West Coast operations where they do a lot of the actual filming for programs. We met with certain actors of color, actresses of color, producers, directors, the talent agencies. You try to get a sense of the big picture and how race factors into Hollywood and the production process in Hollywood. Well, what was really interesting during this process for me is that I was paired with an attorney from Washington, because after all, we had to pick people who would then testify before the commission. So they had attorneys go out, and they paired them with people who had a substantive knowledge of whatever the particular topic was. And I was engaged in this low-level struggle over the entire period. It was about 6 months with this guy who was a holdover from the Bush administration. Because a lot of the people working for the commission were civil servants who had been appointed in the previous commission. And even though the new administration had come in, the way it was set up, they couldn't clean house and start from scratch. It took a while before people, eventually their term was up and/or they moved on to other things. So that was kind of eye-opening to me in the sense that there were certain questions that everything I had studied about media and race to that point prompted me to ask, and these were the very questions he refused to ask. And even when they weren't asked, and he got answers to questions that were sort of like the 500-pound elephant in the room or whatever, he tried his best to frame it in a way that I guess diffused the significance of race or racial disparity or inequality in what was happening in Hollywood. That was significant because there was an interesting political struggle among the commissioners who were also, some of them were appointed by the previous administration, only a few were appointed by the new administration. And in the end, this particular report was unlike any of the earlier reports that had been done on these types of issues, because it was about 5 years before the report was actually released. And when it was released, it was merely descriptive of the testimony that had been given. There was no recommendation, there was no analysis, none of the stuff that came out of some of the early reports in the late 70s that were much more critical of the industry and at least gave hope at that point to a different future. I tell you all this to say that the television industry is a very interesting industry. This particular book, as you know, is focused on television. It's not really looking at film or any of the other types of media. In fact, this book is the first in a 4-book series that I'm editing with Oxford University Press, looking at television and blackness. The second book will be looking at news, all forms of news, television, radio, print, and so forth. The third will be looking at film and race. And the last one will be sort of a capstone volume that looks at the connections and the interconnections between various forms of media. This particular book, I think, was motivated, this series was motivated by the experiences I've had both as someone working within in the media and as someone sort of studying it from outside, as well as someone working with a number of advocacy groups in the Los Angeles area for the last 10 years who've been concerned with questions of race and representation. What I attempted to do with the book was to fashion really a textbook of sorts that could be used by upper-level undergraduates and by graduate students interested in these questions, as well as the lay public who are interested in this never-ending issue of media and media diversity, a hot topic the last few years. Most of you are probably aware of the NAACP-led coalition that threatened to boycott the networks a few years back over questions of diversity. This is an issue that I talk about in the book as one that recurs every few years or so. And there's almost a cycle that you can discern whereby there's some outrageous representation of a minority group. There's a public outrage of some sort. The industry responds. They offer token remedies. The pressure decreases, and then business as usual kind of returns. You can almost see the cycle. And so we're at a particular stage of the cycle. What I try to do in this book is put in one place a number of the critical studies that have been done over the years on questions of media and race. And specifically, I'm looking at African Americans. Because of the relational nature of race, it's hard to talk about African Americans without also talking about other groups. And this is the way racial formation works. But I did feel, when I kind of conceptualized this project, that there was a specific need to look at African Americans and to focus in on African Americans. And that particular choice led to a number of themes that I think framed the volume. And the first theme is sort of revisiting the legacy of the binary group, which has sort of fallen from favor in recent years because of, I think, the recognition, rightly so, that we really moved to this multiracial, complex society of hybridized identities and subjectivities and so forth and so on. and that race, is never formed in a vacuum. It's always formed in relation to other notions of race. But nonetheless, I argue in this book, there's something significant about this binary that continues to operate in the realm of television. And I try to demonstrate this early on in the book by sort of working through some of the theoretical writings on this topic, and then making connections where appropriate to some of the empirical pieces that follow the book. Very briefly, the book is 15 chapters. The first and last chapters I wrote sort of bookend chapters, which try to pull it all together. The other 13 chapters are offered in roughly chronological order from when they were originally written. The first was written in 1968. It comes from the Kerner Commission, the report that came out looking at the riots of that period. And there was an important chapter in the book which deals with the role of media in those events. And it's very, I guess, revealing in terms of what I refer to as the symbiotic relationship between governmental authority and media. And it's pretty subtly done, but nonetheless, we can see in some of the later studies in the book how some of the ideas in that particular report found their way into the daily practices of news media, and I argue shaping the type of news representations of blackness and race in general that circulate in the news today. There are a number of other chapters which I would say come from the social scientific perspective, either based on survey research and quantitative data of one sort, that try to empirically show some type of connection between images on television and attitudes and behaviors out there in the real world. There are other studies that come from a more critical perspective that aren't really rooted in empirical data as much as they are in theory and theoretical observation and analysis based on the various theoretical frameworks. There are pieces that actually engage in audience research, look at shows like The Cosby Show, for example, which is a seminal show, I think, in the history of television, and I think a cautionary tale of sorts in terms of what Bill Cosby and Alvin Toussaint, who was the Harvard psychiatrist who worked with them on that show to recode blackness, what they actually were able to achieve in that show, despite, or rather because of its immense popularity. In closing, I just want to say that there's a profound relationship between what we see on television and what's happening politically in our society. It's very easy to kind of forget that and to kind of see television as entertainment, as something that, in the end, you watch it because you don't have anything else to do, or maybe I don't watch television that much, so what's the big deal about television? Well, lots of people do watch television. It's an important cultural form in our society. In fact, it's one of those things that more of us probably engage more time in than any other form, believe it or not. It's a place where we sort of identify with the images we see, or we distance ourselves from those images as we negotiate our identities and try to figure out who we are and who we're not. It's also a place where the powers that be and those who challenge the powers that be duke it out in terms of various ideological struggles over what's good, what's right, what's wrong, what's just, and so forth and so on. So this collection, I think, is my attempt to bring into one place a number of studies that look at sports programming, that look at fictional television series, that look at news, to try to get a sense of the big picture and what's going on here and how these things are connected as we wrestle with the issues of race in society. At this point, I'd like to answer any questions you may have about the book or any of the issues raised by the book. Yes?
This is a huge topic and very challenging.
Yeah.
So first of all, kudos for embracing it. When you talk about representation, we're always talking about the black folks are underrepresented.
Right.
But in your estimation, what is the standard? And what point will we say that we are adequately represented, or perhaps overly represented, or sufficiently represented? What is the standard in your estimation in this construct?
Well, there are two senses in which we can talk about representation. We can talk about representation in terms of proportionate representation, the relationship between our numbers in the population and what we see on the screen. There's also sort of the cultural studies, media studies understanding of representation, which talks about the types of images that are in circulation. that, you know, a certain idea is literally being represented to us through media, okay? And there are a slew of theories I won't get into that talk about the ideological significance of representation that I do talk about in the book. So in a sense, both senses of representation appear in the book. But your question is about the first. That the whole issue of what is adequate in terms of representation is one of those questions that I don't know you can come up with a definitive answer for. I mean, one standard we can apply is, you know, sort of the divergence between, excuse me, the proportion in the overall population and what we see on television. I mean, if you see a crazy disconnect between those two, then something is probably happening, right? But, you know, how close do you have to be to say that nothing is going on? We could probably debate that until the cows come home. You know, I don't know. But one thing is for sure, we can start to think about how the presence of African Americans on television is distributed. Do we see patterns in where those images appear? For example, by network, or by night of the week, or in situation comedies as opposed to dramas. And if so, over time, if these patterns appear to be enduring, what do they tell us? When we combine that with ethnographic accounts of how the industry works and how decisions are made by producers and writers and so forth and so on, we can start piecing together the big picture of what's happening in terms of these racial images. And that doesn't tell us a lot about what the impact might be, because, you know, to really do that, you have to have some sense of how audiences are interpreting those images. But some of the studies in this book do attempt to do that. And combined with other studies of audience perception, we can start making some educated guesses about the types of ideological work that are being performed by these images and the way they're being patterned in media. So I guess to answer your original question, you know, I think you would want to see something approaching proportionate representation, but you'd also want to break those numbers down and try to figure out, you know, where the images are appearing, and see if those patterns are to your liking, or whether they seem to suggest that, you know, African Americans are only suited to certain types of portrayal. And indeed, that's what we tend to see. African Americans are actually overrepresented in primetime television, according to the studies we've done and recent studies of this phenomenon. And moreover, they tend to be ghettoized in certain time, in certain types of images, and certain networks, certain types of media, that type of thing, which raises some very interesting questions about how race is being channeled, and hence the title of the book. Yes?
How about the people, like African Americans within the media, as actors, writers, in the newscast? What are they doing to change that? Are they forming organizations among them, like, and say, hey, we have a word about this, or we don't agree with this portrayal? Or are they consenting to the ideas or what the TV stations want to portray them?
Sure. But you have a little of both. And the question is, what is the ultimate outcome of those, I guess, strategic maneuvers and choices? You have groups like the Organization of Black Screenwriters, for example, who, you know, are a subgroup of the Writers Guild, who have been together for years, you know, trying to advocate for black writers specifically. And other groups have their own groups, and then there are sort of inter-ethnic alliances as well. Then you have groups like one that I belong to, I'm actually vice president of right now, called the Media Image Coalition, which is made up by representatives from a number of advocacy groups interested in questions of race and diversity and media representation. NAACP has a membership in that organization. The National Hispanic Media Coalition, the Media Access Network for Asian Americans has a membership. GLAD has a membership. There are a number of groups that have memberships, and they, again, get together and share horror stories and strategize over how to break through this cycle, this business as usual that tends to define racial representation practices in the industry. That said, it's a very insular industry. It's very hard to get work. It can be very lucrative if you can crack the industry and get in and get a work, get a job. It's like this revolving door of opportunity. But very few people of color have been able to do so. In the last couple of years, about 8% of all television writers have been people of color. That's across all racial and ethnic groups. You know, about 31% of the U.S. population, only about 8% of the writers were people of color. White males are highly dominant, followed by white females in terms of writing positions, directing positions, producing positions. And the few people of color who do get in are struggling so hard to keep that foothold that I'm not going to say they go along with the status quo. They just might not challenge the status quo as they might as you might otherwise imagine they would because of sort of their interest in maintaining their position. Now, what most of them do, and what some of them have done, who've been quite good at this, is they've brought along other writers of color, kind of brought them up through the ranks and gave them their first opportunities. The Cosby Show, for example, was sort of a milestone, I guess, in black involvement in television. A lot of the current black executive producers working in television and writers on major shows all kind of came through the Cosby Show, and so the opportunity they got about Bill Cosby and the folks who put that show together. A Different World, which was a spin-off of the Cosby Show, was also another important training ground. And those two shows alone probably I had to look at the numbers, probably account for half or more of all the writers and certainly producers who are African American working in television today. So we're talking about very few opportunities. And so when you get in, you never know how long you're going to have a job because your show might not make it through the year. You don't know if you're going to get picked up for another show. And so under those conditions, you're only going to rock the boat so much. Or if you do rock the boat, you're going to rock it in ways that you may be able to defend in terms of the quality of the show. Well, I need these particular writers because they have a perspective that will allow me to tell a story I can't tell with other writers. But you're not going to get up on the political soapbox and make arguments because you're not going to get hired in this way. And a lot of the actors who have wrestled with these issues have sort of had to make this sort of strategic choice. How much trouble do I want to cause to, at some point, maybe lead to a change in the way things work versus do I want to work tomorrow? And so it becomes a very difficult trade-off for a number of people who are working in the industry or trying to work in the industry today. Yes?
Could you share with us, Darnell, some thoughts about the impact of corporate media and the joint venture?
Yeah. Well, that exacerbates the problem I'm talking about. In the book, we kind of talk about a number. I realize I kind of left out the other key themes that I kind of cover in the book. The binary is one of them. The power of media is another. What impact does media have on society? So I kind of explore the research that has been done on this over the years. The whole question of negative versus positive images. Sort of problematize that. What does negative really mean? What does positive mean? Well, the answer is it doesn't mean anything in isolation. All of these things are defined in relation to other things. And the context becomes very important. What was positive 20 years ago may quite likely be viewed as negative today. So the politics of positive and negative are very slippery and ambiguous politics at times. And so you can kind of see that play out by the various actors in the drama over the types of images we prefer and how we're going to support those images or protest those images. And then also the question of markets versus motives. Are these racial patterns we're seeing the benign effect of sort of the market doing its thing, or are there some other considerations or motives at play beneath the surface that really explain the patterns we see? And I argue that in a way it's sort of the question kind of misses the boat because the market itself is heavily raced. And even if we buy that the market's operating here, we can see race already sort of built into the mechanisms of the market, explaining the type of outcomes we see. Things are structured such that people of color don't have a snowball's chance in hell in really breaking through and changing things in a meaningful way. So when you raise the question of corporate ownership, there's been this increasing trend toward consolidation of media outlets to the point where 5 or 6 companies today own about 90% of what we see across all those hundreds of channels that they would have us believe give us all these consumer choices. In fact, what we really see are recycled programs originating at the same source, shifted in time, replays the same old stuff, and again, reflecting the same dynamics that underlie the insular industry that I talked about in the first place. Now, with increasing consolidation of ownership has come vertical integration, where a number of the media companies now not only own the outlets that broadcast the programs, they also own the suppliers that produce the programs. so that NBC Productions produces most of what NBC airs. What is it? Fox, Studios produces most of what appears on the Fox-owned network and so forth and so on, which of course crowds out points of access for smaller concerns, which might be the only opportunity for people of color and those traditionally locked out to actually have an impact or get in or get involved in it. There was a time when independent producers were the bread and butter of the television industry. Stephen J. Cannell's and all these other companies that became trademark names, with their little logo and the thing after the show that you sort of associate with the show. No more. I mean, there are very few of those around. Only the biggest ones. And they tend to have 5 or 6 shows each, so that the actual points of origination have shrunken almost to those 5 companies and maybe a few mega independent production companies, which doesn't bode very well at all for up-and-coming talent or people of color for the most part. Add to that the talent agencies, which package deals across production companies and with the media and with these large companies, it becomes nearly impossible to really break in and to get a shot to even have your day in court so people hear your idea, however it might be. So it doesn't look very good the way the industry itself is structured. Chances are, absent some radical change, it will just reproduce the insularity that we currently see. Yes?
You had mentioned binary versus in a world of multiculturalism.
Right.
Is binary significant because it is a phenomenon that will not occur with other races, or is it a model for what will happen with Latinos and media, or whatever other races are to follow?
Well, what's interesting is that if you look at television and racial representation on television, African Americans and white Americans are overrepresented. Everyone else is underrepresented, some of them to the point of invisibility. You don't see Native Americans at all. Latinos are woefully underrepresented in primetime television. Asian Americans, interestingly enough, are reaching proportionate representation. They're not there yet, but then they're not there in any significant roles. I mean, there are no shows about them. There are no Asian American themed shows. The only one that ever appeared on television, All American Girl, didn't last a season. That was, 9 years ago. And then, of course, the Asian American characters you see tend to be, marginal characters for the most part, friends of the main character. But the story is not theirs, the narrative is not about them. Not true with African Americans. There are lots of African American TV shows. In fact, probably more now than ever at any other point in time in history. And certainly, the standard has been, white-oriented shows. So there's something interesting about this dichotomy, this white-black dichotomy, that a number of people have written about. Winthrop Jordan, the historian, talks about, black in the mind of the European, when the white and black races were being created, preceding slavery and everything that would occur after that. And the way that this particular binary opposition, which, by the way, is so potent because the thing about binary oppositions is that the poles define one another most perfectly, more than any other term can. In this sense, meaning is relational. So in order to define whiteness in a particular way, you need blackness, all right? So throughout the history of our society, as we think about racialized stereotypes, if we think about racial tropes, if we think about discourses that have been used to disempower and so forth and so on, they've always been rooted in a binary way of thinking, whereby blackness can be sort of defined as the supreme opposite of whiteness, in ways that exalts whiteness and creates the perfect foil or the reference point. Toni Morrison has talked about this in some of her work in terms of American literature. Franz Fanon has talked about it in terms of psychology, the psychology of the binary. And it's still there, despite the underlying quote-unquote reality of our decreasing diversity. And it does play out in popular media. It tends to, in some respects, be frozen in time in terms of the way it's organized, the way it's structured, and the way the representations flow from that organizational structure. So, what I think you're asking your question is, what does that mean about other groups, as our society becomes increasingly diverse? Well, clearly, we see the disconnect between the representation. Now I'm talking about the second sense. Well, I'm sorry, the first sense in terms of proportion of characters on television and proportion in the real society. But we also see subtle workings of the binary in place, where other groups, I think, are positioned in terms of the second sense of representation relative to the poles in the binary. Racial formation, as a number of scholars have pointed out, is a fluid process. It occurs over time, and groups are racialized, and the meanings of those categories often change over time. And the political context becomes key. Certain groups that were defined as members of another race at one point in time, like the Irish, for example, when they first immigrated to this country, eventually became white, or they were allowed entree into the white club, so to speak. Other groups have moved back and forth in terms of their racialized designation, both officially in terms of our U.S. Census and in terms of popular consciousness. Indians, from India, for example, considered Asian American now, at least in the official, census designation, were once considered white. Mexican Americans have sort of shifted back and forth in terms of their categorization. Now, of course, we talk about Latino officially not as a race, but as an ethnic group, at least in terms of our government. But I would argue that the group still is racialized in certain ways, in terms of the way we think of race as a representation, as a way of structuring society, as a way of, I guess, distributing resources along certain lines and forming alliances and so forth and so on. So I think my basic answer to your question is that the binary still operates despite its profound lack of or its profound disconnect from the underlying reality. But it works more in a constructionist sense in that it's working to try to situate groups relative to one another in racial space. And I think that if we think about racial politics that are happening now in our society, emanating from the government and other places, in the images we see on television, we often tend to see a lot of congruence between some of the ideological messages that may be sent quite implicitly and these political agendas that we know operate. Back and back. Deb.
Oh, sorry. Just a quick comment on the binary. I think the comments just suggest a reality about the black-white binary. Sometimes we think that it's just about blacks and whites, but in fact, historically, the black-white binary has had a multiracial regulatory effect. It's affected people across a range of identities. So that's at least one way of understanding the black-white binary. But I have a question that follows up on the one about representation. And I'm interested in your thoughts about the standards for representation in the second sense, right? So what would you say to a policy approach that went something like this? In thinking about how we should represent blackness, we should have a proportional approach that approximates black social position in society currently. So that there's a problem to the extent that there are too many black doctors on television, too many black lawyers on television. So the representational issue is not just about numbers in terms of it approximating the 10 to 13%, depending on how you count.
The first sense.
In the first sense, it should also be about the substantive content of blackness in society in the second sense. So are you worried about arguments about overrepresentation with respect to positive images in that sense, and what would your standard be for managing that?
Well, you can't talk about the Cosby Show without engaging that question.
Right.
And there, of the 15 chapters in this book, I think that 5 of them that are wrestling with that very issue. And that comes back to the issue of positive versus negative. And, is the goal, as the NAACP has argued throughout most of its history, going back to Birth of a Nation, its protests over Birth of a Nation, to Amos and Andy and so forth and so on, that we're in a period where we're trying to move toward an integrated society. In order to do that, we need to be promoting positive images of African Americans so that they'll be seen as acceptable members of society. That was sort of their agenda. That was their goal in a nutshell. It worked, so to speak, in various ways. I mean, they ultimately, Birth of a Nation continued, and it's still, of its time, the most popular and most watched film ever. But certainly, they got Amos and Andy, off the air eventually. It did, continue in reruns and so forth and so on until the early '60s. But it certainly raised public awareness about the importance of representation in the second sense and the impact it may have on politics. The answer is, I mean, it's a tricky question, because anything you're likely to come up with may be so contextually bound that the moment you come up with the answer, it's no longer the appropriate answer because of the way things are shifting and changing. And that is due to the relational nature of meaning and the way meanings are constructed. The one thing that I guess we can say with some certainty is that to go to either extreme, to sort of privilege or to demand the positive image, whatever that is, or to go in the other direction and say we need negative images that show how bad things are so that we can convince people that something more needs to be done. Either one of those are fraught with all kinds of problems, and they've been tried to a degree. The Cosby Show was an abysmal failure in terms of sort of the way it really resonated with regressive Reagan politics, of the early 1980s. It debuted in 1984, on the occasion of Reagan's landslide re-election, and I remember when it came out. I mean, I was really looking forward. It was sort of like a breath of fresh air. A lot of the audience members who were interviewed had the same response. Black audience members in particular, and said, "Wow, finally we're seeing an image of African Americans that we can be proud of, and this, that, and the other." Which, of course, is what Bill Cosby and Alfred Prasad were trying to construct. What they didn't intend, and what they didn't expect, was that the white audience would, for the most part, draw a very different reading of the show. One that, in many respects, absolved them of any responsibility for continuing racial problems. Presented the Huxtable family as the model of the Negro who's made good, and in fact, African Americans have overcome that. After all, you have this obstetrician, and there are all these interesting racial, sexual things encoded in his character as well. This woman who's an attorney. They have these 5 kids who are not engaged in any of the types of problems that the news media were telling us that black youth were engaged in at that time. Living in this brownstone in Brooklyn, nice life, highest rated show on television. It makes me feel good to invite them into my home every Thursday night and watch the show. I must be a liberated white American. There's no reason for me to support affirmative action or these other programs that are rooted in the notion that we're still mired in racial inequality. We're beyond that. This show is proof positive. And for a lot of people, that was the way they understood it. While it's hard to draw cause and effect between that and the continuing political support and popularity of Reagan and then later Bush, certainly there was the association in place there. And Bill Cosby himself, offered some of the money that supported the study that was done of this, and was quite disappointed with what they found. That's why his second show looked at a working class black family, if you recall. The show didn't do very well at all. It didn't make it all that long, but he was trying to tinker with the formula they had come up with before to try to be present blacks with dignity, but maybe at the same time to sugarcoat it and make it seem like things were better than they really were. And it didn't quite come off in the same way, I would argue, because it didn't resonate with what the powers that be wanted to hear. Yeah.
I was at university here in the 80s, and there was a lot of talk about international issues like the New York border, information border, and the international information communication border, and UNESCO. And you said you had experience. I wondered whether you had thought about what would be better policies, particularly like now that Michael Powell is out. And I noted that you have in here Diane Watson saying that she wants the CPD, the Congressional Black Caucus, not to have a direct role in formulating policy. I wonder whether you have any ideas and whether international issues are of any concern to you and cooperation with particularly African nations. Speak on that. And also the PhD program in African Americans.
Wow, that's a huge question. Well, we don't currently have a PhD program.
I know you don't, but she kind of studies that. So I just wondered where that was going, and also, the international and policy issues.
Well, the answer is, the second question, I'll take that one first, it's the easiest question. We're always, exploring the question of departmentalization and when the right moment might be for, African American studies. So that discussion continues, and I'll keep you posted. some interesting challenges relative to other ethnic groups when it comes to questions of enrollment. And most of you are aware of what's happening with African American students and the rate at which they're being bid to the most competitive campuses that you see, UCLA, UC Berkeley. It's not good for us, which makes it hard to mount a viable program, particularly if the program is not going to be supported from the very top, taking those realities into account. So we're kind of working on that, because I think all of us would like to see a PhD program, and certainly the field has evolved to the point where it makes sense to do that. The question is, can we do it at the level that we would demand to do it? That is to say, have 8 absolute top-notch programs. It's hard to do within an IUP structure when you don't have dedicated resources to the program. So we're working on that. We're trying to figure out ways to explore that question. And I guess time will tell whether it's a viable option, how soon it might be viable. The other question had to do with UN experience. Very briefly, my experience with the UN, there was a preparatory conference preceding the Durban conference back in 2001 that I participated in that summer, which dealt with questions of media, race, and diversity. And of course, the issue was the role that media access and involvement plays in democracy and in allowing the voices to be heard, basically. And so the case study I talked about was primarily the U.S., but people in the audience were from NGOs and groups from all over the world, and so they were looking at the case of the U.S. So my work per se wasn't about the world or about touching on UNESCO or some of these other groups necessarily, but it was sponsored by the United Nations and did become a part of the record that the group I guess put together for that particular Durban conference. I think that the gist of your question has to do with
Policy, FCC.
yeah.
Policy.
Well, I mean, the FCC was instituted, back in the 20s, to really regulate what was then considered to be a public good, the airwaves, in the public interest. And no company, was thought to own those public airwaves. The public did. And so the idea was, you have a governmental agency empowered to see that the broader good is somehow preserved by kind of balancing all the interests that are in place. My argument in this book is that over time, and sort of mirroring changes in politics at the national level, the FCC has really become more of a booster for the industry, and as a sort of like a governmental agent, making sure the various private enterprises have an environment whereby they can maximize their profit. And it's almost like the public interest and what's important to us about the airwaves has been largely forgotten. And then they, to the degree that they gesture toward that mission, they point to things like increasing diversity in terms of media channels as somehow or another solving the problem of media consolidation in terms of ownership and so forth and so on. And in the process, to my taste, haven't really dealt with the racial and ethnic diversity thing at all. I mean, there was a time when there were all these reports that were required by television stations, and it's what you get to report. Your employee base by certain type of positions, this, that, and the other. Well, all of that has been sort of liberalized out of existence for the most part, and there's very little teeth at all to any of the regulation in place that really is sort of designed to ensure that there is going to be racial inclusion at the table of media production and media dissemination. So, that's where we are right now. And again, it's very consistent with the broader political, platform that we're living under and some of us are struggling with.
Take one more question, LS.
Actually, sorry.
I can ask you later.
Okay, I guess my question is, is there any discussion with the impact of BET, Black Entertainment Network, and its positive or negative impact on channeling Blackness and how it's portrayed to the media?
I actually, you can't do a book like this without at least mentioning BET. BET doesn't show up. There isn't a chapter specifically on BET, but BET comes up periodically in some of the studies. Particularly, I think, there's a chapter on here on college sports, and the role of like black bodies and again representing some notions of what blackness is. And BET comes up in that chapter, I believe, talking about historically black colleges and, and some of the sporting programs that BET broadcast over the years. I reference it, I believe, in the first chapter when I talk about increasing media consolidation. In fact, that BET was sold, there's never really been a black network, and BET may have been the closest thing to a black-owned, even though it was never really completely black-owned. It was always, Johnson always had a certain percent of the ownership, a majority, like a 51% majority. I think HBO owned like the other 49% throughout most of BET's existence when it was a major entity. And of course he sold it for like $3 billion and became this incredibly rich guy. But even in its heyday, it wasn't like people really saw BET as this panacea. I mean, BET was recycling old music videos. I mean, there were all these things that BET could have done that BET didn't do because Robert Johnson was first and foremost a businessman. And he was making money and he did a great job of it. And all these other altruistic, community-oriented things, they had a few shows here and there, and a few forums, this, that, and the other. But looking at what BET had compared to some of these other media operations that had global news operations, this, that, and the other, I mean, it pales in comparison. And certainly didn't realize the promise of, what I think a lot of people thought BET could have been. And there's some new upstarts now that are attempting to kind of fill in where BET left off, and it just remains to be seen whether they'll be able to do it. Bill Cosby tried to buy CBS at one point with a group of investors, and it was rather quickly and quietly dismissed. And the irony, of course, is that NBC has been variously called things like the nigger broadcasting company. Back in the day when it had, Nat King Cole on, or Nothing But Cosby, when the Cosby Show was the #1 show and single-handedly resurrected NBC. But when Cosby went to buy it with a group of pretty reputable investors, they just, no way, we're not going to give this up, despite the pretty beautiful position NBC was in at the time.
Okay, we'd like to thank Dr. Hunt for his before we get to signing of the books, I have a few announcements, but maybe Dr. Hunt would like to mention 2 other events coming up in which the center is involved that relates to race and television.
Oh, yeah. March 17th, details forthcoming. We are partnering with the NAACP, Beverly Hills Hollywood branch, to put on a show which for them is going to be a prelude to the NAACP Image Awards, which could itself spawn a whole discussion here. But nonetheless, we're partnering with them to put on a panel discussion around issues of diversity in media, and particularly as it pertains to African Americans again, but looking at all groups. On March 17th, and we don't know exactly where it will be on UCLA's campus somewhere. We're also collaborating with film, television, and digital media, department here, and I think they're going to have the venue, so it could be in one of their auditoriums. We just haven't gotten the definitive word of that yet. But the date is firm, because it has to do with the taping of the NAACP Image Awards. So that's coming up, and that's sort of a kickoff to a bigger event that we're going to have in May. May 6th and 7th, which is a follow-up to the conference we had last year with Diane Watson, that one of you referred to, Diversifying Hollywood. And this one is called Hollywood and Race, Where Have We Been, Why Are We Going? Okay, Race and Television, Where Have We Been, Where Are We Going, Why Do We Care? In other words, why is this stuff important in the first place? What is it about television and its role in society that should make us take stock of what's happening? What is likely to occur based on what we know about the way the industry is structured? What are some of the constraints that make it hard to break out of these business as usual practices? So what we plan to do is bring together panels of scholars who have done research, legal minds who maybe have done research on sort of potential areas of policy intervention for getting at some of these questions, as well as actual producers, writers, directors who live with these constraints day in, day out, and how it has shaped some of what they can do, like the question you asked. Do they feel hamstrung? How much can they speak out? What happens when they speak out? And what do they do because of these constraints? And the goal of the event is to hopefully come away with some further agenda items, and at least some questions that are more focused over kind of where do we go next on this whole front. Because lots of people have been talking about this, but very little has changed.
Just a few quick announcements. I'm continuing the theme of race. Many of you have gotten the flyer. Pretty much this is along the lines of race and music. There will be another book signing today with our sister organization, Asian American Studies. It's on the history of a hip-hop generation, and that's at 2:30 today. Also, continuing the theme of race, next week, all of the ethnic study centers will be hosting a town hall meeting on faculty diversity. That's across the hall in Chicano Studies on the 17th at 12 noon. Please come out to that. And we'd like to thank the president of the Black Faculty and Staff, Renee Dennis, for coming. She has a few flyers that are there. Most importantly, the event that's coming up with the Pan-African Film Festival, Sweet Honey in the Rock. This activity will be taking place February 20th. We also have our Student Affairs Officer from the IDP portion of the Bunche Center, Dr. Elizabeth Gant-Britton, and it's the 30th anniversary, and that's coming up on the 23rd. Please refer to this flyer. And I don't know him, but I spoke to him on the phone. Malcolm is here from the UCLA Black Alumni Organization, and we are co-sponsoring with them an event with Nikki Giovanni next week, along with UCLA Live. See Malcolm, raise your hand for tickets with that event and a reception beforehand. 17th of February. Busy day, the 17th. Want to thank all of you for coming out. We'll keep you informed of other activities. And feel free to get the book. It's a nice rainy weekend. Curled up with it. No more football, so just, read.
I have one quick comment, actually. I just realized I neglected to thank a number of people here at the Bunche Center in particular for working on this project as well. Candace Moore, sitting over the back, was just indispensable. She did a lot of the editing on the early drafts of my chapters, as well as organizing and getting the rights to reprint some of the other classic studies that appear in the book. And there are about 15 students associated with the African American Studies IDP and other departments around campus who had an interest in media and race, who worked for the last 3 or 4 years on the Prime Time and Black and White study, which sort of is the backdrop of the final chapter that I'm looking at, sort of prime time images of Blackness over the last 5 years or so. So I just wanted to thank them again. I don't see many of them in the room, but just so you know. And Leticia, of course, for working on the publicity for this particular event and for the book release and so on. So thank you all.
Thank you again for coming out and stay dry.
Yeah.